I thought I misheard her. I set my teacup down on the saucer, the way my mother taught me 60 years ago, and I asked her to say it again. My daughter-in-law smiled the way she always smiled when she was about to say something sharp. That careful smile. The one she'd practiced in mirrors. I was sure of it. She said, "Margaret, we've been talking, and we think it's time you started looking at a nice retirement residence, something with other people your age. You'd be happier." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow was falling slow over the maple in the back garden, the one my husband Douglas planted the summer we moved into this house in Peterborough 41 years ago. Douglas had been gone almost 2 years by then. I still left his reading glasses on the side table in the living room because I couldn't bring myself to put them in a drawer. I asked her where this was coming from. I asked her if my son had put her up to it. She said, "Benjamin and I have been talking about it for months. He just didn't know how to bring it up. You understand." I said I did. I said I understood perfectly. I didn't. Let me tell you how we got there. Because the story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts much earlier, on a Tuesday in March, when my son Benjamin phoned me from Oshawa and said the plant was closing. He was 44 years old. He'd been there 19 years, and the severance wasn't going to stretch the way a severance used to. His wife Carla had her hours cut at the dental office the same month. They had 2 children, my grandchildren. Ethan, who was 12, and Sophie, who was 9, and a mortgage on a townhouse they'd bought at the top of the market. I told him to come home. I told him all 4 of them should come to Peterborough, stay with me, save what they could, figure things out. The house had 4 bedrooms, and I was rattling around in it alone like a dry bean in a tin can. I had a widow's pension. I had what Douglas and I had put aside over the years. I had the house paid off since 2011. I could help. I wanted to help. That's what mothers do. Benjamin cried on the phone. He hadn't cried to me since he was 11 years old, and his golden retriever got hit by a car. He said, "Mum, you don't have to do this." I said, "Benjamin, my love, it's already done." They sold the townhouse that June. They moved in on the 1st of July, Canada Day, and I remember I had a little flag stuck in the flower pot on the porch to welcome them. Sophie ran through the front door and wrapped her arms around my legs and said, "Grandma, are we living with you now forever?" And I said yes. I said yes, my darling, for as long as you need. The first year was lovely. I won't pretend it wasn't. Ethan walked to school with his hockey bag and his cheeks red from the cold, and Sophie helped me roll out pie crust on Sunday afternoons. Benjamin found work at a logistics company in town. Not as good as the plant, but steady. Carla took a job at the Shoppers Drug Mart on George Street. We ate supper together every night at the oak table. Douglas built himself the first winter we were married, and I thought, this is what a house is for. This is why we build them. But something started to shift somewhere in the second year. Slow, the way the dark comes in November. You don't notice until suddenly it's 5 o'clock and you need the lamp on. It started small. Carla rearranged my kitchen. She put my good china up in the cupboard above the fridge where I couldn't reach it without the step stool, and she said it was because Sophie might break them. She took down the photographs from the hallway, the ones of Douglas and me on our trip to Prince Edward Island for our 30th anniversary, and she put up a family portrait of just the 4 of them from a studio in the mall. She said, "It's more modern, Margaret, don't you think?" I didn't think so, but I didn't say anything. It was their home, too, I told myself. They needed to feel settled. Then she started talking to me the way you talk to a child. When I'd tell a story at dinner, she'd interrupt with, "We've heard this one, Margaret." When I'd offer to pick Sophie up from ballet, she'd say, "I think it's better if Ethan does it. Your reflexes, you know." My reflexes were fine. I'd driven the same Honda Civic for 12 years without a scratch on it. But I started letting Ethan take Sophie to ballet anyway, because it wasn't worth the look she'd give me. Benjamin didn't see it, or he saw it and didn't know what to do. He worked long hours. He came home tired. When I tried to mention once that I felt a little pushed aside in my own house, He rubbed his forehead the way his father used to and said, "Mum, Carla's under a lot of stress. She's trying her best." I said, "So am I, Benjamin. So am I." He didn't really hear me. By the 3rd year, I was eating my breakfast alone. Carla had decided the family ate later, at 8, because of the kids' schedules, and I was up at 6 the way I'd been up at 6 my whole life. I'd sit at the oak table with my tea and my toast and the newspaper, and I'd look across the kitchen at Douglas's old chair, and I'd talk to him in my head. I'd say, "Doug, I don't know what happened." I'd say, "I think I'm becoming a ghost in my own house." And then one Sunday, in February, Carla asked me not to come to Ethan's hockey tournament. She said the bleachers were too cold for me. She said Benjamin had made a carpool with another family, and there wasn't really room in the van. She said, "You can just have a quiet day, Margaret. Wouldn't that be nice?" I watched them pull out of the driveway through the living room window. Sophie waved at me from the back seat. I waved back, and I stood there in my cardigan until the van turned the corner, and I couldn't see them anymore. And then I sat down on the sofa, and I cried for the first time since Douglas's funeral. I cried because I understood, finally, what was happening. I wasn't a mother anymore in this house. I wasn't a grandmother. I was a room they were trying to empty out. So when Carla sat me down at the kitchen table a few weeks later, with her practiced smile and her brochure for Cedarbrook retirement living folded neatly in her hand, I wasn't even surprised. I was just tired. I was 67 years old, and I was tired. She said, "We've put together some numbers, Margaret. If you sold the house, you'd have plenty to cover Cedarbrook for years. It's really quite reasonable. And Benjamin and I could help the kids with their university funds, with what's left over. Isn't that a lovely thought? Your legacy, going right to your grandchildren." I asked her if Benjamin knew she was saying this to me. She said, "Of course. We talked about it all weekend." I asked her if she'd called the residents. She said, "I put down a deposit on Tuesday, just to hold a spot. They fill up fast." I looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. And I thought about Douglas, about the morning in 1984 when we'd walked through this empty house with the real estate agent, and Douglas had squeezed my hand and said, "This is the one, Meg. I can see our kids in this yard." I thought about Benjamin at 6, pushing a little plastic lawnmower around in circles behind his father. I thought about the kitchen counter Doug laid with his own hands one weekend when I was pregnant with our second, the baby we lost at 7 months, the baby nobody ever talked about after. I thought about how I'd held Douglas's hand in the hospital in the spring of 2023, and how the last thing he said to me was, "Take care of our home, Meg. That's all I want." I said to Carla, "I'll need some time to think about it." She said, "Of course. But, the deposit is non-refundable after a month." I said, "A month is plenty." I smiled at her. And I'll tell you, I hadn't smiled like that in a long, long time. Something about it must have unsettled her, because she didn't smile back. That night I sat in Douglas's old armchair, and I took out a yellow legal pad and I made a list. Not a list of feelings. I'd done enough of those in my head. This was a list of names, and numbers, and addresses. The first name I wrote down was Helen Prideaux. Helen and I had taught grade 3 together at St. Joseph's for almost 20 years before we both retired. Her son was a lawyer in Cobourg, a good one, quiet and smart the way Helen was, and he'd handled Douglas's estate for us. His name was Paul, and the next morning I drove to Cobourg, just me and my Honda Civic and my reflexes that were apparently no good, and I sat in Paul's office and I told him everything. Paul listened the way a good lawyer listens. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When I was done, he folded his hands on his desk and he said, "Margaret, first things first, whose name is on the deed?" I said, "Mine. Just mine. We never put it in joint names after Douglas died because I wanted the estate simple." He nodded. He said, "And have you ever lent your son money that's still outstanding? Any formal loan? Any co-signed mortgage? Anything like that?" I thought about it. I said, When he and Carla bought the townhouse in 2013, I gave them $20,000 for the down payment, but it was a gift. I have the letter I wrote for the mortgage company saying so. It was never a loan, he said. Good, that simplifies things. I said, Paul, I want to sell the house. He didn't flinch. He just asked me, are you sure? I said, I've been sure for a week. I just didn't want to admit it. He said, where will you go? And that's when I told him about the cottage. Douglas and I had a little place up on Stony Lake, north of Peterborough, that we'd bought in 1999 for not very much money because it needed a lot of work. We'd spent 20 years fixing it up, one weekend at a time. Douglas had rewired it himself. I'd stripped the wallpaper in the bedroom over 3 summers. It was winterized. It had a wood stove, a good one. It had a view of the lake through the birches that made me feel like I could breathe again just thinking about it. Benjamin and Carla thought I'd sold it after Douglas died. I'd let them think that because Carla had kept asking what I was going to do with all those assets, and I hadn't liked the way she said the word assets. So I'd told a small lie. A lie by omission, really. I'd said I was making arrangements for the cottage, and I'd left it at that. What I'd actually done was transfer the cottage into the name of a small family trust that Paul had set up for me the month after Douglas's funeral. Douglas had wanted me to do that, before the end. He'd said, you keep that cottage, Meg. That's ours. That's where we were happy. Paul said, Margaret, are you telling me you want to sell the Peterborough house and move to the cottage, full-time? I said, I'm telling you I want to go home. He put me in touch with a real estate agent named Delia McKinnon. I met her at a Tim Hortons in Coburg because I didn't want anyone from my church seeing me with a real estate agent in Peterborough and asking questions. Delia was in her 50s, brisk, kind, didn't waste a word. I told her what I wanted. She listed the house on a Thursday in mid-March, while Benjamin was at work and Carla was at her shift at Shoppers and the kids were at school. The listing was private, off-market. She already had a buyer in mind, a young family from Oakville, a doctor and a teacher with 2 little ones who'd been looking in Peterborough for 6 months and losing every bid. They came up on a Saturday, while Benjamin took the whole family to a hockey tournament in Lindsay, which Carla had once again told me I should sit out because the drive would be too hard on my back. I unlocked the door for Delia and the young couple, and then I walked down to the Starbucks on Hunter Street with a book, and I sat there for 3 hours reading the same page of a mystery novel without taking in a single word. They offered over asking. I accepted before the tournament was over. The closing was set for 45 days out, which gave me exactly 45 days to plan the rest of my life. I didn't tell Benjamin. I didn't tell Carla. Every night I sat at the supper table and listened to Carla talk about Cedarbrook, about how nice the common room looked in the brochure, about how I'd make so many friends, about how liberating it would be to not have the burden of a whole house to manage anymore. I nodded. I said, That's a good point, Carla. I said, I'll think about it. I said, You're very thoughtful to look into all this for me. And Benjamin would look at me over the rim of his beer and I'd see something flicker across his face, something almost like worry, but he never said a word. In the mornings, while they were at work and the kids were at school, I packed, not boxes. Boxes would have been noticed. I packed 1 tote bag at a time. I drove up to the cottage twice a week with my car full of the things I couldn't bear to lose. Douglas's reading glasses, my mother's wedding china, the quilt my grandmother made for me when I married Douglas, the one with the double wedding ring pattern, the box of photographs that Carla had taken off the hallway wall and stacked in the basement, the Christmas ornaments Benjamin had made in kindergarten, the popsicle stick snowman with the googly eye that had fallen off in 1987, the cassette tape of Douglas singing the Log Driver's Waltz badly at our 25th anniversary party, his wedding ring, which I'd worn on a chain around my neck since the morning after he died. I left the furniture. All of it. The oak table Douglas built, the armchair he died in, the 4-poster bed we'd slept in for 41 years. I left it because I knew what I needed to carry and what I needed to let go. And I was finally getting very, very clear on the difference. 3 weeks before closing, I went up to the cottage on a Wednesday and I stayed overnight, something I'd started doing now and then to get them used to my absence. I lit the wood stove. I made myself a cup of tea and I sat on the old plaid love seat by the window and I watched the ice break up on Stony Lake. The cracks sounded like rifle shots in the dark, and I thought about how that's what a life makes, sometimes, when it's finally warming up after a long freeze. A loud noise, a breaking, and then open water. I called Sophie from the cottage that night. Just her. I'd bought her her own little flip phone for her 10th birthday, against Carla's wishes, so she could call me whenever she wanted. I told her I loved her. I told her that I was going to be moving soon. I told her that wherever I went, she and Ethan could always come. I said, "You'll always have a grandma, sweetheart." "That's a promise," she said. "Grandma, are you going to Cedarbrook?" I said, "No, my darling. I'm going somewhere much better." She said, "Can we come see it?" I said, "Any time you want, any time at all." The day I sold the house, Benjamin was at work and Carla was at Shoppers. The kids were at school. It was a Friday in early May. The papers were signed at Paul's office in Coburg at 10 in the morning. The money was in my account by 2 in the afternoon. I drove back to Peterborough, to the house that was now someone else's house for 48 more hours, and I walked through every room. The kitchen where Douglas had made me coffee every morning for 41 years. The nursery-turned office where I'd rocked Benjamin as a baby. The back garden where the maple was just beginning to bud. I said goodbye to all of it. I thanked it. I told it, "I'm not leaving because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I do." I took the last few things that would fit in my car and I drove to the cottage. I left a letter on the oak table. I won't tell you everything I wrote. Some of it is between me and my son, but I'll tell you what it said at the top, because it matters. I wrote, "Benjamin, when you were 3 years old, you asked me once where the sun went at night. I told you it went home. You thought about that for a long time and you said, 'Mummy, do people have to go home too?' And I said, 'Yes, everybody has to go home eventually. I'm going home now. Please don't be angry. Please just love me, the way you used to.'" I wrote about the house being sold. I wrote about the new family moving in on Sunday morning, and that he and Carla and the kids had until Saturday night to be out. I wrote that I knew this would seem sudden, but that it had been a long time coming, and that I hadn't been cruel, only honest at last with myself. I wrote that I had not left them without options. I had paid first and last month's rent on a furnished 2-bedroom apartment in a good part of town, 5 minutes from the kids' school. The address was in the envelope. The lease was in Benjamin's name. I'd covered 6 months. I wrote that after that, they were on their own, and that I thought that was the kindest thing I could do for all of us. I wrote, "At the end, I love you, Benjamin. I have loved you since before you were born. Nothing that's happened changes that. But I am not a guest room. I am your mother, and I am still here, just not where you left me." I signed it. I put the keys on top of the letter. I walked out of the front door of the house Douglas and I had built our life inside, and I closed it behind me. Benjamin phoned me at 7:14 that evening. I know because I looked at the clock. I let it ring. He phoned 11 more times. He left 3 voicemails. Carla left 1. I didn't listen to any of them that night. I sat on the love seat at the cottage, and I watched the sun go down over Stony Lake, and I drank a glass of the red wine Douglas had put away years ago for something worth celebrating. I listened to the voicemails the next morning. Benjamin's voice was hoarse. He said, Mum, what have you done? Mum, please call me. Please, I don't understand." Carla's voicemail was different. Carla's voicemail used words I won't repeat. She called me selfish. She called me cruel. She called me a few other things, too. I listened to it once, and I deleted it, and I made myself a second cup of tea. I called Benjamin back at 10 o'clock. I told him I was fine. I told him where I was, though I didn't give him the address. I told him I would see him when I was ready, and not before. I told him that if Carla came with him, I wouldn't open the door. And I told him I loved him, and I hung up. He came up 2 weeks later, alone. He'd driven up through the back roads because I'd told him how. I watched his car come down the long gravel driveway, and I went out on the porch in my cardigan, and I waited for him. He got out of the car, and he stood there, looking at me, and he was 44 years old, and his hair was going gray at the temples, and I could still see, in his face, the little boy who had asked me where the sun went at night. He walked up the porch steps, and he put his arms around me, and he cried, and I cried, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Finally, he said, "Mum, I didn't know. I didn't know she was doing that to you. I wasn't paying attention. I was so tired. I let her talk me into things that weren't true. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I said, "Benjamin, I know." He said, "I don't know if Carla and I are going to make it." I said, "That's not for me to decide." He said, "The kids ask about you every day. Sophie cries at bedtime." I said, "Tell Sophie her grandma's at the cottage. Tell her she can come up any weekend she wants. Tell her I'll teach her to roll pie crust in a kitchen where nobody will put the good china out of reach." He laughed, a wet laugh, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand the way he used to when he was 9. He didn't ask me for money. He didn't ask me to come back. He just sat with me on the porch, and we watched the loons on the lake, and he said, "Dad loved this place." I said, "I know. Me too." He brought the kids up the next weekend. Carla didn't come. She never has. I understand she's moved to Burlington with a man she met at work. Benjamin got a smaller apartment in Peterborough, and the kids are with him most of the time now. Ethan comes up once a month to help me stack firewood, and Sophie spends 2 weeks with me every July. She's 11 now. She's learning to row the old cedar strip boat Douglas restored in 2004. She's very good at it, better than I was. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I feel bad about what happened, if I think I should have handled it differently, if I should have stayed and talked it out, or given Carla another chance, or just gone to Cedarbrook and made the best of it the way she wanted. I tell them no. I don't regret any of it. Because here's what I learned, at 67, in a Peterborough kitchen, with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. A life isn't the house you live in. A life is the choices you still have the courage to make. And the day my daughter-in-law decided I was a problem to be solved, I stopped being a problem. I became, again, a woman. The same woman Douglas fell in love with in 1979. The one who made her own decisions. The one who knew her own mind. I still have his reading glasses. They sit on a side table by the love seat here at the cottage, next to a small framed photograph of the two of us on the dock in 2001, sunburned and laughing. Sometimes I pick them up and I hold them for a moment, and I say, out loud, to the quiet room, "I took care of it, Doug. I took care of our home. Just not the way anybody expected." And then I put them back down, and I go on with my day, because the sun always goes home eventually, and so, in the end, did I.